You're listening to a podcast from The Conversation. The year is 1841. Cassandra Austen crouches before a crackling fire, casting precious letters from her late sister Jane into the flames. Nearly 25 years have passed since the novelist's death, and she still misses her terribly. In this final act of sisterhood, Cassandra destroys 2/3 of their correspondence, preserving only 160 of Jane's letters. After Jane's death, aged just 41, Cassandra wrote, "I have lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as can never have been surpassed. I had not a thought concealed from her, and it is as if I had lost a part of myself." Perhaps those unconcealed thoughts were the reason the letters were burned, but many Austen fans suspect that Jane's pen was simply too cutting to be entrusted, uncensored, to her legacy. While we may not have Jane's letters, we do have her novels. I'm Anna Walker, Arts and Culture Editor at The Conversation in the UK, and you're listening to Jane Austen's Paper Trail. In this podcast, experts uncover the real Jane Austen to celebrate 250 years since her birth. In each episode, with the help of my colleagues Naomi Joseph and Jane Wright, we'll be investigating a different aspect of Austen's personality, interrogating the pages of her novels with leading Austen researchers. Along the way, we'll visit locations important to Jane to uncover a particular aspect of her life and the time she lived in. In this episode, we're delving into Austen's first novel, Sense and Sensibility. Gossip, and the fear of it, plays a central role in this story. In the rumours that swirl through its pages, we'll find out what Austen herself thought about gossip and the people who spread it. But first, it's time for tea in a place that meant a lot to Jane Austen. Welcome to episode 1. Was Jane a gossip?
Tastes delicious.
The buns are about as big as our heads, and they look huge, and they've got lemon curd on the top with a little bit of a lemon, and it's really lovely. You should cut into yours because you haven't even had breakfast yet.
I will. I'm just going to do that now.
This is my colleague Jane Wright and Andrew McInnes, reader in English literature at Edge Hill University. They're digging into the famous buns at Sally Lunn's tea rooms in Bath, where Jane Austen herself is thought to have exchanged a tale or two.
So Sally Lunn's tea room actually dates back to the late 17th century, but these days it's very much styled as a Regency tea room with beautiful chinoiserie-style crockery and plates on the wall and gilt-edged mirrors and cartoons of the Regency period by
James Gilray, a famous caricaturist.
James Gilray. So, Andrew, how important was the ritual of taking tea as the setting for a good gossip?
I guess it was really important. So it'd be one of the main ways for women to get together and talk privately. And when it's, a busy tea room like Sally Lunn's would have been, there's sort of talk all around. So you have that ability to have that private discussion in public.
So who do you think Jane would have come to Sally Lunn's with?
Well, when you look at her letters, you can see that she had quite a wide social circle. Young people, her own age, sort of older people that she would talk about and discuss. But she came from a very close family, and I think she'd really want to come to somewhere like this with Cassandra.
Would gossip then be considered in a different way to the way we think about gossip now?
It was part of the culture as it is today. So it was circulating in lots of different forms. We sort of mentioned the caricatures in Sally Lunn's as a sort of part of the Regency decoration. And that was ways of spoofing political figures, but also figures of fashion, sort of making a sort of visual joke about people that were being gossiped about at the time. But that gossip was also published in a wide range of ways. Scandalous memoirs, newspapers and magazines would be making remarks about how people lived. And I think sort of novels, Jane Austen's novels and also other novels that were being published at the time are ways of encoding gossip and also using gossip to sort of drive the plot.
And gossip plays a key role in Sense and Sensibility, Jane Austen's first published novel, where spies are at the heart of the action. The novel follows the Dashwood sisters, pragmatic Eleanor, passionate Marianne, and young Margaret, who are forced to leave their family home upon the death of their father. They move to Barton Cottage in Devonshire, offered to them at a low rent by their mother's cousin. But as they settle into their new life, they encounter secrets, rumours and gossip, often fueled by the notorious Mrs. Jennings, that threaten to aggravate their already precarious situation. Central to all this is an intricate love triangle going on between Eleanor, a young woman called Lucy Steele, and the shy but honourable Edward Ferrars.
I want to talk about the idea of gossip being different things. So it's liberation, it's intimacy, it's fun, but it's also got a darker side, hasn't it?
In the 18th century, gossip was looked down upon as generally a bad thing and was written about in conduct books, which were sort of guides for generally young ladies on how to behave. So that's a sort of dismissal of gossip as vacuous idleness. That's kind of the backdrop of how kind of religiously, I suppose, gossip was viewed at the time. And I think in the world of Austen's novels, gossip sometimes seems like quite a dark, threatening thing. And I think that's one way of thinking about gossiping neighbours as a group of people that enforce certain social structures and kinds of civility. You can't behave too badly because you need to keep up your reputation, which is a central thing in Sense and Sensibility.
It's a very powerful thing as well, this kind of intel, because as you say, reputation was everything, especially for a woman.
Yes, and if you get gossiped about, your reputation can be diminished or called into question. So that's how gossip can be a sort of disciplinary thing for society. Austen is really careful in Sense and Sensibility to say that a few of the quite mean and evil characters are reputable, and because they have that good reputation, they're essentially free to do what they like in private. The reputation that comes with money gives you freedom for quite a lot of bad behaviour.
For someone with such a keen eye, who liked to satirise polite society, do you think Jane both despised and enjoyed gossip?
Absolutely. She obviously had quite a sharp pen for the cutting remark.
Some people are a bit shocked when they find out how kind of bitchy Jane was in some of her letters.
I think she's sort of fabulously bitchy. So there's a famous example which is sort of shocking, and I think that's why it's famous, where she says, Mrs. Hall of Sherborne was brought to bed yesterday of a dead child, some weeks before she expected, owing to a fright. I suppose she happened unawares to look at her husband, suggesting that her husband was so ugly that it would cause a miscarriage. She's doing this for fun, right? It's sort of meant to provoke perhaps involuntary laugh. You can see in places where she shows her good characters kind of despising gossip. So there's a moment when in Sense and Sensibility when Eleanor meets the older Miss Steele, and Miss Steele tells her this story about what's happening between Lucy and Edward, who are sort of secretly engaged, right up to what feels like the present moment. And Eleanor suddenly realises that Anne Steele has been listening at the door rather than getting this news from a proper channel, and she's horrified to have been in an improperly gossiping situation. And I guess Austen wants us to see that as funny. Like, it is funny that Eleanor gets this news from a gossip and she feels awful about it. But there's also this side where Eleanor's good sense and sort of virtuousness has been conned into getting this news in sort of ill-gotten ways that make her really uncomfortable. So there's that sort of double-edgedness to Austen's writing, where she does say that some of these gossiping characters are sort of ridiculous and silly and pathetic, but also a lot of the fun and the amusement and the comedy comes from the same characters gossiping and giving the news and driving the plot forward.
And that's something that your own research looks at, the idea of silliness and ridiculousness in the romantic tradition.
Yeah, Sense and Sensibility has that sort of joy in silliness running through at least the edges of the novel as a complete counterpoint to all this angst that's going on in the middle.
Yes, and I suppose it was a way of, making life, bearable, that for a lot of women would have been, quite difficult in terms of the restrictions placed on them. Yeah,
it's a sort of alternate route through the world, isn't it? Silliness is kind of, is much more purely liberatory than the gossipy world, which can have this sort of dark side and its nastiness.
And given that Jane Austen clearly mined her own life for the sort of plots and things that happen in the novel, and from what we've seen in her letters, would your verdict be that she is? a gossip?
I think she absolutely was a gossip. And I think, like, there's a way in which you can think of gossip as a sort of guilty pleasure, right? Like, that it's something that Austen knows is wrong, but she still indulges in. The wrongness of the pursuit is part of the pleasure, right? And it's a fun way to sort of drive the plot of her novels and provides her sort of endless content for her letters as well.
And of course, everyone loves a good gossip.
Absolutely. And over giant bums.
Especially.
My colleague Jane Wright there with Andrew McInnes. For me, nothing beats a good gossip. Coming up, I sit down with two experts to explore how Austen used gossip, for good and bad, in the pages of Sense and Sensibility. More after this short break.
Hi, it's Liv Little.
It's Miranda Sawyer here, and we are the hosts of the newest culture podcast out there. We have notes from The Observer.
As writers, we give and take notes all the time. It's part of the fun, especially when it comes to culture. But now we're sharing our thoughts on the most interesting stories dominating the zeitgeist.
No headline skimming here. We promise to give you the insightful takes, plenty of debate, and a recommendation or two.
Listen to new episodes of We Have Notes every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. And I'm joined now by two experts to talk about gossip in Sense and Sensibility. Lucy Thompson is a lecturer in 19th century literature and creative writing at Aberystwyth University. She looks at how surveillance played out in literature at the turn of the 19th century. And Katie Halsey is a professor of English studies at the University of Stirling. She researches Jane Austen and the history of reading. Thank you both for joining us on the podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us.
So Jane Austen began work on Sense and Sensibility when she was still very young. By some accounts, she started the book some 16 years before it was published, when she was only around 20 years old. What is the role of gossip in this book? Katie?
There are lots of different roles for gossip in the book, I think, is the answer. It's absolutely spread throughout the whole book. Sometimes Jane Austen uses it to suggest that a character is less than worthy or a bad person. Sometimes it's used to carry the plot so that we actually understand what is happening. Sometimes it's used to misdirect, so gossip can point us in the wrong direction. It's very often used for comic effect. I think there is a dark edge to some of the gossip in Sense and Sensibility. So there's a real sense that a reputation is very, very easily lost. There's a wonderful part where Marianne, one of the sisters who's the heroines of the novel, her sister Eleanor is the sensible one, and Marianne is the kind of spontaneous, impulsive, foolish one. And Marianne has gone to see the house of the young man she's in love with, Willoughby, who at that point looks as if he's also in love with her. So she's gone to see Allenham, which he will inherit from a distant relative in due course. And she's gone by herself in an open carriage, which is something that isn't necessarily a terrible thing to do reputationally. But what she has done in that open carriage, of course, is open to doubt.
Because Willoughby has joined her in the carriage, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're by yourself with a young man as a woman in an open carriage, you could be doing all sorts of naughty things. And Eleanor can hardly believe it. She just can't believe that Marianne would have been so reckless with her reputation, so foolish to open herself up to that kind of gossip. And Marianne says, well, yes, I did do this, and I don't think there was anything wrong with it. We always know when we're doing wrong, and our own conscience is what should dictate. But Eleanor says, no, that's not true. My dear Marianne, as it has already exposed you to some very impertinent remarks, do you not now begin to doubt the discretion of your own conduct? Marianne replies, though, if the impertinent remarks of Mrs. Jennings, and Mrs. Jennings is the kind of major gossip of the novel, are to be any proof of impropriety in conduct, we are all offending every moment of our lives. I value not her censure any more than I should do her commendation, which I think is just a really kind of lovely moment in the novel where we see the difference of the sisters being articulated in their responses to impertinent gossip.
So, I mean, from what you've talked about there with Mrs. Jennings, do you think that Austen is saying that a gossip or someone who gossips is a lesser person? You mentioned being less worthy.
I think there are moments in the novel where that definitely seems to be the case. Certainly Marianne thinks Mrs. Jennings is less worthy. And there's moments where Eleanor herself thinks that it's better to have good breeding, that is to be quiet and not impertinent, than to have good humour and kindness. But Mrs. Jennings also has a really, really kind heart. So it's hard to say. There's a lovely moment in the novel where Margaret kind of lets out the secret that Eleanor is in love with Edward Ferrars. And then throughout, there's all these jokes about the letter F, which is the word that his name begins with. Now, all of those moments, I think, with Mrs. Jennings are definitely meant to show that she's just a bit silly, a bit vulgar, a bit impertinent. But then there's that moment much, much later in the novel where it is gossip that actually does quite a lot of good, because it's Colonel Brandon, who's quite rich and he will end up marrying Marianne. He has what's called a living, so he has a parish in his gift to give to Edward Ferrars. And it's only because he has heard of Edward's engagement and the fact that Edward has acted really well that encourages him to give that living to Edward. So it is gossip there that is an active force for good. I don't think it's black and white, I suppose, is what I would say.
And Lucy, at the heart of the novel is also a lot of misunderstanding, a lack of communication. Can you tell us a bit more about that and the role it plays?
Yeah, absolutely. So the lack of communication comes from sort of sisters hiding things from each other. So Eleanor is very carefully guarding her feelings about Edward Ferrars. And about most things, she is said to be very good at kind of watching her own emotions, regulating and ensuring that her mother and her sisters don't find things out. And Marianne is seemingly, I suppose, concerned about what Eleanor might say about her ill-judged, as she calls it, visit to Allenham. So she doesn't tell her sister things. And sisters not telling each other things is a bit of a theme. So Eleanor resorts to trying to figure out whether Marianne has sent any letters to Willoughby, in that period where they're not communicating. She wants to find out what's been happening. And so there's a kind of dearth of information. And the way in which they want to find out that information is through kind of gossip and through spying on each other.
So each of the Dashwood sisters, Eleanor, Marianne and young Margaret, react differently to gossip in the novel then, don't they? Very different approaches.
Yeah, Eleanor almost always wants to close it down. She is one of those people who wants what would have been called in the period rational conversation as opposed to frivolous gossip. And when she does hear gossip, she's quite often horrified by it. Marianne's also horrified by gossip, though, actually. She just doesn't listen to gossip. There's really amazing moments where, there'll be people talking in the room and Marianne just walks off to the piano and starts playing the piano and just doesn't listen to it. And poor Margaret, well, we don't hear that much about Margaret, but she seems to sort of pick up snippets here and there of gossip and mainly put them together correctly, actually. But she's sort of too young to be allowed into the full secrets of people in the novel.
Yes, and you sort of mentioned there the idea of gossip versus rational conversation. What constitutes rational conversation in Sense and Sensibility?
I think talk about music, talk about books. So one of the reasons that Marianne and Willoughby fall in love to begin with is because they have massively shared interests, or at least Austen's a little bit cagey about that. They seem to have shared interests, but it turns out later on that he's just kind of picking up on her enthusiasms and kind of sharing them. Rational conversation, I suppose, would also be discussion of politics, discussion of the news, perhaps the less kind of celebrity scandal news, but the actual news, the things that are happening in the world. Rational conversation would also be about religion. I know this sounds extraordinary to us today, but people genuinely did have conversations about the sermons they had heard. They would talk seriously about theological problems and talk about history. Conduct books very, very regularly recommend the study of history, not just as a knowledge base for women, but as a really good way of starting conversations that are then rational.
Lucy, which of the sisters' reactions to gossip do you think the reader is supposed to agree with or think is the right reaction?
Oh, I think that's a difficult question because I'm not sure Austen knows precisely how she feels about gossip, because we do see the positive sides and the negative sides. So Marianne is quite harsh about gossip, particularly about Mrs. Jennings' gossip. She comments of Mrs. Jennings that she cannot feel. Her kindness isn't sympathy, her good nature is not tenderness. All she wants is gossip, and she only likes me now because I supply it. And then this rational voice of Eleanor comes in to say that actually she feels that's quite a harsh judgment of Mrs. Jennings, who is not being malicious in her gossip. She really does want to look after kind of the young women and the young people around her. She's quite comic, she's quite jolly, she doesn't necessarily realise that she's putting her foot in it. And often Mrs. Jennings is trying to fill silences and awkward moments with gossip, which I think is quite a valuable social skill a lot of the time. So I don't think we're supposed to write it off in quite the same way that Marianne does. But also, I think we're not necessarily supposed to take Eleanor's view that you should never gossip, because it can be so valuable.
And it might be worth saying as well that Mrs. Jennings isn't entirely wrong in thinking that some young ladies like to be laughed at about their lovers. I mean, the novel's really clear that Anne Steele only wants to be laughed about by the doctor, is the phrase. So she has this chap who's interested in her, or may not be interested in her, who's a doctor something, and she just wants people to accept or recognise that she's pretty enough to have a lover, and that lover might be the doctor. So if Mrs. Jennings was talking to Anne Steele all the time, they'd get on like a house on fire. That form of gossip would work really well for those two characters.
So Eleanor can be quite nervous around Mrs. Jennings's loose tongue, but probably for good reason, because defying social norms, as Marianne frequently does, certainly in the first half of the novel, calling out to Willoughby across a party, giving him a lock of her hair before they're engaged, these actions all brought the risk of reputational damage. What sort of risks were norm-defying women like Marianne taking when they became the subject of gossip, Lucy?
On the extreme end of things, a complete loss of reputation would damage your marital prospects and also sort of leaves you ostracised from society. That's the sort of very worst that women could expect. And we see that play out in other novels of the period, women who are suffering kind of reputational damage. And conduct manuals of the era are quite firm about exactly how horrible it could be for women if they were to lose their reputation. On the lighter side of things, they're sort of being chastised, then they don't get to be part of the social groups maybe that they would like to be part of. They're not invited to certain events. They might end up losing a potential suitor because they were considered too frivolous, I suppose, or they were considered to have done something inappropriate in a carriage.
I was just going to say, there's the shadow story of the two Elizas. The first Eliza is the wife of Colonel Brandon's brother. Colonel Brandon himself is in love with this Eliza, but she's made to marry his brother for complicated family reasons. She and the brother don't get on, and she essentially ends up having a series of affairs and an illegitimate child, who is the second Eliza. And the second Eliza, in a stunning twist, is seduced by Willoughby, the young man who Marianne wants to marry, and cast off, left in poverty, in a kind of terrible state. So Willoughby and Colonel Brandon then fight a duel over the fate of Eliza. But all of this is kind of told in retrospect by Colonel Brandon to Eleanor. So we never see any of those events actually playing out in the novel, but they're there as a kind of terrible reminder of what could happen to Marianne, not just to any woman who is too free, let's say, with a man, but actually a woman who's too free with the same man that she has been going about in an open carriage with.
It's one hell of a cautionary tale, that, isn't it?
Yes, it really is.
Were there any sort of particular cases of women losing their reputation in that way that Jane would have been aware of in real life?
There's a ton of celebrity women, I suppose. Emma Hamilton is the most famous of them all. So although she sort of ended up doing quite well for herself in becoming Nelson's mistress, before that, she had a pretty rocky road, really, with, again, an illegitimate child and lovers who cast her off and a marriage that was very unhappy. I won't say everything was known and played out in the press, but a lot of it was.
There's so many that you could talk about. You've got Lady Seymour Worsley, who has a kind of famous, her whole private life is played out in the press. Her husband accuses her of infidelity, and they have a protracted divorce case, which is eagerly published in newspapers, which talks about how she has been sexually active outside of her marriage. He has been as well. And also that he was kind of complicit in allowing his friends to watch her get undressed in a bathhouse. And eventually she sort of reclaims her status because she writes that she's not ashamed of what she's done. She has her own doctor testify as to how many men she has been sexually active with during her marriage because of the fact that her husband has neglected her, and also that he was sort of promoting this behaviour. And that was hugely popular in the press. The newspapers sold out of that and had to keep reprinting accounts of it. So Austen would have likely been familiar with all of that kind of thing.
Yeah. There's the Princess Caroline scandal. So in 1806, there was a massive scandal in the press where the Princess Caroline, who was the wife of the Prince Regent, was thought to have had an illegitimate child and have had several lovers. And Parliament actually was involved in what was called the Delicate Investigation, and all the details of that leaked out into the press. So Austen, she writes in a letter about her support for Princess Caroline, something along the lines of, I will support her just because she's a woman. But then she goes on to say that even had she behaved in the ways that the press suggests, it was the Prince Regent's fault. It was his fault for treating her as he did.
I love that story.
Yeah, it's a good one.
I mean, on that lighter side of the reputational damage that you talked about earlier, Lucy, my mind's sort of going to Jane Austen's cousin, the French Eliza, as well. Is that a woman who could have influenced the writing in Sense and Sensibility?
Yeah, I certainly think so. The outlandish cousin, as she was known at the time. She elopes young, she marries a French nobleman who's then beheaded during the French Revolution. Austen admired her, but others, even members of Austen's own family, we have accounts of them gossiping about her. I think it's another cousin who blames her for her conduct, says that they will now resign her acquaintance. I'm sure that he says he has always been concerned for her and pitied her and regretted the manner of her life. And they were certainly very close. She ended up marrying Jane's brother, Henry. So close, in fact, that Henry and Eliza end up helping her to fund publishing Sense and Sensibility. So Jane retains the copyright and pays for the publishing, and Eliza helps her with that. So you can tell that they're closely involved in each other's lives. So she would have been aware of people kind of gossiping about Eliza and some of the scandal that was associated with her.
So we've sort of flirted with this idea of France throughout our conversation so far. Lucy, your research points out how, as well as social policing through gossip, state surveillance was also increasing when Austen wrote Sense and Sensibility because of the ongoing war with France. What did that mean in practical terms for authors like Austen, and how is she processing those ideas in this novel?
Yeah, it's interesting. Britain is terrified that those revolutionary ideas from France are going to come to the shores. The government responds by clamping down quite hard. It bans criticism of the monarchy. It suspends habeas corpus, so you could be held indefinitely without trial if they felt you had said something incendiary or something against what the government wanted you to say. So they sent out spies to root out dissent, to uncover anybody talking about things that they didn't want to talk about. And writers that Jane would have been aware of, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they have spies sent after them when they're staying at the Stowey because people believe that they are spying for France. Percy Shelley ends up having to escape to Wales because the government believe that he is sending too many letters and that this is suspicious and that he is sending letters to France. And this creates a culture of suspicion. One writer at the time says that every keyhole is an informer. So state surveillance sort of trickles down to people watching each other, looking at their peers and seeing if they're doing anything unacceptable.
Why did people believe particular writers like Coleridge could be spies?
Literature was a way to get news out. It was a way to influence people's political opinions. So writers were quite powerful, and the government became very concerned about what writers might say and how this might influence people and how they would behave.
Talking of influence and status, I wanted to touch on that from a slightly different angle. The gossip of servants is quite important in this book. It's a servant named Thomas, for example, who tells Eleanor that a Mr. Ferris is engaged, which leads her to think that her love interest, Edward Ferris, has gotten married. But in fact, it's his brother, Robert Ferris. Servants carry all the correspondence, they see all the comings and goings. Katie, how does gossip received from servants differ to that received by peers?
I think it's got a sort of dual status as both being possibly more accurate in that servants really did live at very close quarters with their employers, but also it's more negatively perceived because you shouldn't be gossiping with the servants. And of course, in the example you just gave, the gossip is not accurate. So, I suppose it's a different context, but servants' testimony was used in the Princess Caroline trial that I was talking about, and it was taken very seriously because they were the people who had seen the bed sheets, for example, not to be too disgusting. So there is definitely a sort of sense that what servants see is the unvarnished truth. And I think that is there to some extent in Sense and Sensibility, in that Mrs. Jennings does believe her servants when they tell her things.
It sort of comes back to that idea of a network of spies, I think, again, doesn't it? Because as well as fearing state surveillance, you've also got potentially spies in your own household at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of stuff in conduct books. Imagine you're a middle class or a gentry class or an aristocratic person, not allowing your child too much access to the servants because they will hear gossip. They will also hear superstition, ghost stories, kind of gothic-y stuff. So there's definitely a worry about allowing that kind of promiscuous mixing between the classes.
Sure. Apart from the servant Thomas that we talked about just now, is there any other example of misinformation in the novel?
Well, Mrs. Jennings thinks that Eliza, who I was talking about earlier, is Colonel Brandon's illegitimate daughter. One of the things I think is really interesting about that is it really points to the sexual double standard in that Colonel Brandon can still go out in society, he's still respected, he's still thought to be a worthy and deserving suitor of Marianne, whereas Eliza is completely cast out in society.
I was only minded when you were talking about Colonel Brandon that Willoughby, although people are very shocked about what he has done and the fact that he ends up married and engaged to somebody else, actually he doesn't really suffer too many consequences. He ends up with a whole new circle of people around him, whereas Marianne, she does end up being able to marry Colonel Brandon, but actually people are far more judgmental of her than they are seemingly of Willoughby in his behaviour.
There are some quite odd failures of gossip in the novel as well. So why don't Marianne and Eleanor know that Willoughby's making up to Miss Grey? Presumably everyone's talking about it in London.
So Miss Grey is who he ends up marrying.
Is who he eventually marries. She's rich, and he marries her for her wealth because he's afraid that if he were to marry Marianne, his aunt, it won't leave him Allenham. So he marries Miss Grey because he's got a lot of debts and he needs to pay them off quickly.
Yeah, especially because Mrs. Jennings does hear from Miss Grey's guardians about what's been happening. So Mrs. Jennings is aware, but seemingly only after the fact, and it doesn't really make sense that she didn't know it before.
Yeah.
She's quite a powerful disseminator of gossip, Mrs. Jennings, then, isn't she? What she chooses to share and what she keeps back actually really influences the lives of these girls that she's advising almost.
Absolutely, and she encourages others to sort of share information. So Colonel Brandon doesn't know about the fact that Willoughby has abandoned Marianne, and Mrs. Jennings comments to Eleanor, "Oh, do tell him, dear." She's sort of sat in the centre of this network of information, choosing who should know what and when.
I'm almost imagining her like a sort of little gossip spider in the middle of her web. She's getting different information in and choosing what to put out. The story goes that Jane's sister Cassandra burned the majority of her letters after she died. Do you think the kind of reputational damage we've discussed was what motivated Cassandra to do this? Katie, could you start us off on that?
I don't actually think so. I wish I did. It would be a much better story. It would be much more exciting. I mean, there are lots of different theories, aren't there? It could be that the letters said something that was extremely dangerous to Jane's reputation. It could also be they actually say things that are really harmful to Cassandra, which could also be true. I mean, I just think probably they were quite boring. She didn't think there was that much in them, but that's my own personal opinion. Lucy, what do you think?
No, I think the same. I think it would be so nice to think there was some sort of sensational story where they'd been writing to each other about various people and Cassandra was worried about this getting out. But I don't think that's the case.
Kind of ironically, a lot of what we know or we think we know about Austen has been passed down in an almost gossip-like way, hasn't it? The family have said one thing, the next generation has inferred something.
Definitely.
Other writers have taken it up.
Yeah.
I think she'd quite like that. I think she'd appreciate it.
Well, it's been a pleasure gossiping with you both today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Jane Austen's Paper Trail, a podcast from The Conversation. Coming up in our next episode, was Jane Austen a romantic? We head to a Regency ball to talk about Jane's own loves and losses.
She writes, "I'm almost too afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together."
And dive deep into the romances and rejections of Pride and Prejudice.
Is that what you want? Is that what you want women to be? So meek that the person she's in love with doesn't even know that she's in love with him.
A huge thanks to Sally Lunns in Bath for their delicious 18th century buns and for hosting us for this podcast. And to our three experts, Andrew McInnes, Lucy Thompson and Katie Halsey. Keep on listening right to the end of the credits. Katie's got a really fun Austen fact for you. You've heard from our experts and now we want to hear from you. We'll be featuring questions from our listeners about Jane Austen's life and works in a special Q&A episode at the end of the series. So please get in touch directly by email or send us a voice note to podcast@theconversation.com. That email again is podcast@theconversation.com. The senior producer was Eloise Stevens, who did all our mixing and sound design too. Reporting from Jane Wright with production help from Naomi Joseph. Alistair Tibbett and Alice Mason do all our socials and promotion, and Naomi Joseph also helped to design our artwork. Our executive producer is Gemma Ware. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wide audience. You can sign up for our free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us, and tell your friends and fellow Jane Austen fans about us too. What's your favourite little-known Jane Austen fact?
This is a bit of a silly fact, but I do love it. In one of her letters, she talks about one of the douceurs, that means the sweets of getting old, being allowed to sit on the sofa and drink as much wine as you like at social events. And as I get older and want to drink more wine, that makes me feel very happy.
Love that. Katie Halsey there. I'm Anna Walker. Thanks for listening to Jane Austen's Paper Trail.
I'm Gemma Ware, host of the Conversation Weekly podcast. Each week, I speak to an academic expert about a topic in the news to understand how we got here, from global politics to the latest scientific breakthroughs or the big dilemmas facing our planet. My guests draw on their deep research knowledge to pull out what really matters so that you can understand the context without the spin. Follow The Conversation Weekly for new episodes every Thursday wherever you listen to podcasts, and read more stories on theconversation.com.